This is the case against Michael Jackson and why people believe he was innocent. In 1993 in California, Michael Jackson was accused of sexually abusing 13-year-old Jordan Chandler, triggering one of the most invasive celebrity investigations ever. Authorities obtained a warrant to photograph and examine his body, attempting to match markings that were described by the boy. Reports later conflicted on how closely those descriptions aligned, becoming a key point of dispute. While the criminal case was developing, Jackson settled a civil lawsuit for over $20 million with no admission of guilt. After the settlement, Chandler declined to testify, leaving prosecutors without their central witness and resulting in no charges. Supporters saw this as a lack of evidence, while critics pointed to the payout as suspicious. Then in 2005, Jackson went to trial in Santa Maria, California over allegations involving 13-year-old Gavin Arvizo. Prosecutors claimed he groomed and abused the boy at Neverland Ranch, but the defense focused on inconsistencies in the family's timeline and credibility, claiming they had attempted to financially benefit from similar allegations before. After nearly 4 months of testimony and about 30 hours of deliberation, the jury acquitted Michael on all counts. The allegations left a lasting divide. Some former child visitors to Neverland have consistently denied any abuse and defended Michael, including Macaulay Culkin and Corey Feldman, along with other former young actors who have been very outspoken about abuse in the industry but say Michael never would have harmed them. Others point to multiple accusations over time and the 1993 settlement as reasons they believe otherwise. Michael denied all allegations up until his death in 2009, leaving the issue unresolved between a legal record that cleared him and a public debate that never settled. During an interview shortly before his death, Michael admitted he would often talk to child mannequins just to feel less alone. He would also frequently cry at the sight of kids playing in the park, since it was something Michael would never experience himself. Michael had a meeting scheduled at the top of one of the Twin Towers on 9/11. After talking on the phone with his mom late into the night, he overslept and missed the appointment. Because of that phone call, he later credited his mother with saving his life. Here's a 1985 prediction of what Michael Jackson would look like in the year 2000 versus what he actually ended up looking like. As a result of a combination of skin conditions and body dysmorphia, Jackson went through nearly 100 procedures over 30 years trying to achieve his idea of perfection. In 2003, an entire supermarket was shut down so that Michael could live out his lifelong dream of shopping like an ordinary person. All the other shoppers were either paid actors or his friends, and they paid no attention to Michael. He played around the store like a child and even compared the experience to going to Disneyland. In 2002, Michael was staying at a hotel in Berlin when he dangled his 9-month-old son blanket over his 4th-floor balcony. Jackson claimed he was simply excited and wanted to show off his baby to the fans below, but the media was quick to criticize Michael's parenting skills and life-threatening behavior. Jackson later apologized, stating that it was a mistaken judgment and that he didn't mean to endanger his son. Blanket is now 21 years old and rarely makes public appearances. Michael became increasingly reliant on medication after being prescribed painkillers following the 1984 burn incident. Over time, it expanded into a combination of sedatives, anti-anxiety drugs, and sleep aids that he depended on just to function. He reportedly used aliases to obtain additional prescriptions without raising suspicion. But eventually, he lost the ability to sleep naturally, going long stretches without real rest unless he was chemically put under. In his later years, his physician Conrad Murray was administering propofol at home, effectively replacing sleep with anesthesia, leaving his entire routine built around cycles of medication and sedation. In 2018, a man from Rhode Island returned from his vacation in Costa Rica with severe migraines and facial paralysis, initially thought to be a brain tumor. But instead, doctors discovered a rare black mold growing inside his brain, forming dangerous abscesses. The fungus, found in soil, is known for attacking the brain and carries a mortality rate of around 70%, with early cases historically being almost always fatal. Since 1911, only about 120 cases have ever been recorded worldwide. The infection likely entered his body during the trip and slowly spread to his brain, causing several strokes and neurological damage. Because of its location deep in the brain, the mold couldn't be fully removed, but after extensive treatment, the man miraculously managed to survive. In April of 2011, French aristocrat Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès killed his wife, 4 children, and the family's 2 dogs inside their home in Nantes using a .22 caliber rifle while they slept. Investigators later found the victims wrapped in plastic and buried beneath the terrace, alongside religious items and letters suggesting he had carefully planned the murders before withdrawing money, abandoning his car in southern France, and vanishing without a confirmed trace. Despite an international manhunt, sightings, and several false leads over the years, he's never been located, leaving the case one of France's most disturbing unsolved family murder mysteries, with authorities still uncertain whether he escaped abroad, lives under a false identity, or died shortly after disappearing. Here's a rare look at what a camel's toe actually looks like. Unlike most hoofed animals, camels have two toes connected by a large flexible pad that spreads out under their weight. This unique adaptation helps distribute pressure across soft sand, preventing the animal from sinking as it crosses the desert. This might sound impossible at first glance, but every single tile in this pattern is actually identical. The illusion is created by the way the tiles are rotated and arranged, tricking the brain into seeing different shapes, curves, and pathways, even though only one tile design is repeated over and over across the entire surface. Here's an incredible photo of what happens when a solar eclipse shines through the tiny gaps between a tree's leaves. Each small opening acts like a natural pinhole camera, projecting an image of the sun onto the ground below. Because the moon is partially blocking the sun, every projection takes on the same crescent shape instead of appearing as a normal circle of light. The result is thousands of miniature eclipses scattered across the pavement, all changing shape in real time as the solar eclipse progresses. On Christmas Eve in 2008, 45-year-old Bruce Jeffrey Pardo arrived at his ex-wife's house in California wearing a Santa Claus suit and carrying multiple firearms. When the front door was opened by an 8-year-old girl, he shot her in the face before opening fire at a crowded family Christmas party. Bruce then unleashed a homemade fuel dispensing device hidden inside a wrapped present, igniting a massive fire that trapped victims inside as the house burned. 9 people were killed, some by gunfire, and others burned so badly that it took investigators several days to identify them. The fire burned so intensely that parts of Bruce's Santa suit melted onto his skin, forcing him to flee while still on fire. He later drove to his brother's house, where he turned the gun on himself. Investigators later determined the attack was driven by rage over a recent divorce, mounting financial pressure after losing his job, and a bitter custody dispute, with Bruce specifically targeting his ex-wife and her family. Police discovered that he'd spent months preparing, stockpiling weapons, booby-trapping vehicles with explosives, and compiling a list of additional targets, including his ex-wife's divorce attorney, making the attack one of the most disturbing holiday massacres in U.S. history.
My name is Kayla Mueller. I need your help. I've been here too long. I've been very sick, and it's very terrifying here.
That was Kayla Mueller, an American aid worker from Arizona who traveled to the Middle East to help refugees and civilians affected by the Syrian civil war before she was kidnapped by ISIS and held hostage for nearly 18 months. According to reports, she was repeatedly raped and sexually abused by ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who allegedly treated her as his personal captive and sex slave, and moved her between ISIS compounds across Syria to avoid rescue attempts. The footage shown here was part of a proof-of-life video released by ISIS, showing Mueller appearing terrified as she pleaded to be brought home. In 2015, ISIS claimed she was killed in a Jordanian airstrike, though U.S. officials later said there was no evidence the strike hit the building where she was being held, leading many to believe ISIS itself most likely killed her. These men were just arrested for planning something absolutely horrific. Gavin Weisenberg and Tanner Thomas of North Texas were arrested after federal investigators uncovered their deranged plan to sail to a Haitian island, massacre every man living there, and turn the women and children into sex slaves. Court documents say they weren't just fantasizing. They were buying a sailboat, gathering weapons, recruiting homeless people as soldiers, and even running crude training drills in rural Texas where they practiced ambushes and mock executions. Prosecutors say they mapped out the island on Google Earth, drafted a post-conquest government, and talked openly about executing the men, breeding the women, and raising enslaved children, all while one of them was coercing a minor into creating explicit material. The FBI foiled the plot before they could leave Texas, but the indictment describes a plan so violent and delusional, it reads like a real-life blueprint for a modern-day genocide. They now face up to life in federal prison if convicted of the conspiracy charge, and up to 30 years for the charges relating to CP. In 2007, 2 teenagers from Ukraine began abusing animals and recording it on camera, torturing and mutilating stray dogs and cats, hanging them from trees, disemboweling them alive, and capturing their agonizing struggles so they could relive it later. Soon enough, this horrific routine would rapidly escalate into a full-on murder spree. Over just a few weeks in June and July, Igor Sopranyuk and Viktor Syanko killed at least 21 people at random, ambushing vulnerable strangers, elderly pedestrians, children, intoxicated individuals, individuals and women. They bludgeoned victims repeatedly in the face with hammers and steel bars, smashing skulls until faces were pulverized beyond recognition, eyes gouged out while some were still alive, and bodies mutilated with screwdrivers stabbed into eye sockets and abdomens. Soon enough, the killings caused widespread panic in the region, with residents terrified to go out at night as bodies piled up in a brutal, motiveless rampage targeting the weak for fun. The pair was arrested in July of 2007 after police traced stolen cell phones pawned by the killers and matched witness descriptions and video evidence recovered from their phones and computers. In 2009, Sopranyuk and Sayenko were convicted and sentenced to life in prison, while their driver and accomplice was sentenced to 9 years. The case, notorious for leaked footage like the infamous 3 Guys 1 Hammer video, showing the prolonged, merciless bludgeoning and stabbing of a cancer-weakened man, is now considered one of the most disturbing cases of filmed murders. On December 10, 2021, a violent tornado tore through the Rackley family's home near Caruthersville, Missouri. 9-year-old Ernestine and her sisters huddled with their mother in a windowless bathroom, where their mom snapped a final photo to reassure relatives that they were all in their safe space. But moments later, the twister ripped the house apart and hurled the family into a nearby field. While Ernestine's parents and sisters survived with injuries, the 9-year-old girl was tragically killed. In 1999, Texas man Herschel Rawls went into surgery to have his cancerous bladder removed, but he woke up to an absolute nightmare. Without warning, doctors had also amputated his beef bayonet, claiming that the cancer had spread and that the drastic step was necessary to save his life. But weeks later, pathology tests revealed that the penile tissue they had cut away wasn't cancerous at all. After years of anguish, Rawls sued and in 2003 reached a quiet out-of-court settlement, but was left with the grim reminder of how a single surgical decision can leave a patient permanently mutilated. YouTube prankster Vitaly rose to fame in the early 2010s for viral public stunts built around shock, confrontation, and pushing social boundaries. But as his platform grew, those stunts increasingly crossed into real-world violence. In 2014, he was arrested in Miami after physically attacking a woman in what he called a prank. Years later, Vitaly admitted he was high on psychedelic mushrooms when he punched another woman in the face, a completely unprovoked assault that left her with serious facial injuries requiring hospitalization. In 2016, he escalated further by carrying out a bomb hoax at LAX that caused mass panic and resulted in criminal convictions. In 2022, he was detained again after running onto the field during the FIFA World Cup in Qatar, interrupting a live international match and being forcibly removed by security. Afterward, Vitaly's behavior only continued to deteriorate, culminating in his arrests in the Philippines in April of 2025 after a series of live-streamed incidents in Manila where he was filmed harassing mall security guards, confronting random civilians, trespassing on private property, and allegedly stealing a security guard's phone during an altercation. Philippine authorities classified the conduct as harassment, theft, and public disorder, charging him with various offenses including unjust vexation. He's currently detained at a jail facility in Taguig while awaiting trial, and has not been deported after both the United States and Russia declined to accept him. Vitaly has already spent around 8 months in pretrial detention, and if convicted, he faces up to 18 months in a Philippine prison, following a steady escalation from viral stunts to criminal charges. Scientists created this eerie ghost heart by stripping a real heart of every living cell, washing away the blood, tissue, and DNA until only a translucent white protein scaffold remained. Researchers can now inject the empty structure with stem cells in hopes of growing a functioning replacement organ that the body may eventually recognize as its own. Horses have almost no muscle below their knees, meaning their lower legs rely heavily on movement to circulate blood. Because of this, their hooves essentially act as second hearts, helping pump blood back up the leg every time they walk. If a horse becomes unable to stand or move after a serious leg injury, blood flow can fail, causing tissue damage and breakdown that can slowly spread upward from the hoof. This is one reason why severe leg injuries is often fatal in horses. In 1979, 6-year-old Ethan Pates disappeared after convincing his parents to let him walk alone to his Manhattan school bus stop for the first time. He never made it onto the bus, and his case became one of the most infamous child disappearances in U.S. history after his photo became the first ever printed on milk cartons nationwide. Ethan's body was never found, but in 2017, former convenience store worker Pedro Hernandez was convicted of kidnapping and murdering him nearly 38 years later. Hernandez confessed to luring Ethan into a basement with the promise of a soda before strangling him. But his defense argued he suffered from severe mental illness and gave a false confession. He was ultimately sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Before playing Vecna, Jamie Campbell Bower spiraled into heroin addiction and said he was 1 week away from dying. He's talked about waking up in places he didn't remember, overdosing, and losing control of his life. He eventually entered rehab, got sober, and described the experience as surviving the darkest years of his life. Before Stranger Things made him famous, Joe Keery survived a serious car accident that easily could have killed him. The car flipped and was completely wrecked, and he later said he only walked away because the airbags deployed at the exact right moment. The crash left him shaken for years, realizing how close he'd come to death before anyone knew his name. Gaten Matarazzo was born with cleidocranial dysplasia, a condition so rare it affects less than 1 in a million people. It left him without collarbones, caused severe skull and dental abnormalities, and forced him into repeated surgeries to expose impacted teeth and install prosthetics. The condition itself can cause brittle bones, dangerous airway problems, and lifelong complications. Before Stranger Things, he was rejected from audition after audition for his appearance, but the show ultimately wrote his real disorder into Dustin's character, and Gaten now uses his platform to raise awareness for those living with CCD. On October 18, 2017, 32-year-old father of 4 Kenneth White was riding in the passenger seat of a van on the highway near Flint, Michigan, when a 6-pound rock dropped from an overpass crashed through the windshield and struck him in the face and chest. The driver, Kenneth's coworker and friend, could only watch in horror as White collapsed instantly beside him, barely breathing with his brain exposed, before pulling over and desperately trying to keep his friend alive. Investigators later learned the rock wasn't debris or an accident, but part of a sick game. A group of teens throwing landscaping stones at cars just to see what would happen. 17-year-old Kyle Anger admitted he threw the fatal rock, yet only served 3 years in a juvenile facility before walking free in 2021. A punishment that left Kenneth's family completely distraught and searching for answers. In 2015, doctors were baffled when a healthy 5-year-old boy's sodium levels skyrocketed inside a New York hospital, setting off a mystery that would expose a horror no one saw coming. For years, 26-year-old Lacey Spears told friends and followers that her son Garnett was chronically ill, documenting his mysterious sickness online to garner sympathy. But when the 5-year-old was hospitalized in New York, doctors found his sodium levels had mysteriously spiked to near-fatal levels, 182 milliequivalents per liter, so abnormally high that staff initially thought it was a lab error. Surveillance footage later showed Lacey taking her son into a private room and secretly administering large amounts of salt through his feeding tube. Hours later, Garnett suffered massive brain swelling and passed away. Investigators later found feeding bags in her apartment coated with salt residue, along with Google searches for dangers of high sodium in children. Spears was eventually sentenced to 20 years to life in prison, her case becoming a chilling example of Munchausen syndrome by proxy taken to the extreme. This was the horrifying moment a little Chinese girl realized that escalators are not toys. Somehow the child ended up hanging from the outside of an escalator, gripping the moving handrail as it carried her higher and higher above the floor. Unable to pull herself up or climb back down, she was dragged all the way to the top where her body became wedged against a glass barrier. As the escalator continued moving, the handrail kept pulling on her arms, leaving her completely trapped and dangling helplessly above the drop. Luckily, before anything bad could happen, 2 men rushed over, grabbed the girl, and pulled her to safety. Escalator accidents may seem rare, but falls, entrapments, and mechanical incidents have caused serious injuries and deaths around the world. This was the moment a woman instantly disappeared beneath the sidewalk. After getting off a motorcycle taxi in Brazil, she stepped onto what appeared to be a normal manhole cover. Instead, the cover suddenly gave way beneath her, sending her plunging to the hole below. The fall happened so quickly that she barely had time to react, and found herself immediately trapped in the shaft with murky water up to her chest. Luckily, a shocked bystander saw her fall in and ran over to the rescue. She survived with moderate injuries and was eventually pulled from the hole by people nearby. Investigators later determined that 2 men attempted to steal the cover earlier that morning and failed to put it back securely. Though incidents like this are rare, manhole falls can be deadly. Just weeks earlier, a 56-year-old grandma in New York was killed this exact way. A 5-year-old kindergartner in Standish, Maine was recently killed after his arm became trapped in the closing doors of his school bus as it pulled away from his morning stop, leaving him pinned to the vehicle and dragged nearly 300 feet along the pavement. Investigators determined the driver was unaware the child was caught and continued driving until other motorists began frantically signaling that something was wrong. The child child eventually lost his grip, fell into the roadway, and was run over by the same bus, suffering catastrophic injuries and dying at the scene. The bus driver, a 64-year-old woman, was placed on administrative leave and no charges were filed. The tragic death was ruled accidental, but the case triggered an investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board after it was confirmed the bus's door systems failed to detect the child before the vehicle moved, raising concerns about blind spots, sensor limitations, and school bus loading zone safety. Just last week, a college party clip blew up online after looks-maxing streamer Clavicular got brutally frame-mogged by an ASU frat lord standing beside him with zero effort, the camera angle draining his aura in real time. The posture diff locked him into a ruthless side-by-side that spread across feeds like wildfire. The moment triggered instant cortisol spikes and total aura collapse, while the frat leader named Varys leaned into the attention, jester maxing across campus and dropping the nonchalant gimmick that made the clip go viral. Themes across the internet quickly flooded the timeline, going full goon max over every micro-expression like it was a historical artifact, reposting the same frozen frame until it became the only canon version people recognized. Edits kept looping, glaze levels stayed high, and the posture diff turned into permanent lore. What should have been a forgettable party interaction became a snapshot the algorithm refused to let die, slowly reshaping Clavicular's image into a meme defined by one cursed angle. This was the moment skydiving student Christopher Jones suddenly went unconscious during what was supposed to be a routine training skydive in 2014. At around 9,000 feet, his body stiffened and began violently seizing in freefall, his head snapping back as he lost all control, tumbling through the air with no ability to deploy his parachute. Realizing what was happening, instructor Sheldon McFarland chased him down midair, fighting the wind and closing the distance with mere seconds to spare. McFarland eventually managed to grab Jones, stabilize his limp body, and pull his ripcord just in time, preventing a horrific fall that would have instantly been fatal. If you're a bad person who's afraid of heights, here's a sneak peek of what hell looks like. During a sudden storm at Six Flags Mexico in August of 2024, riders on the Sky Screamer swing ride found themselves trapped nearly 250 feet in the air as heavy rain and strong winds moved in. Instead of descending, the ride's automatic safety systems activated and locked the chairs in place, leaving passengers suspended high above the park with their legs dangling as powerful storms intensified around them. For roughly 10 minutes, riders were forced to remain exposed to the storm with no control over the situation, unsure of what would happen next or if the ride would be struck by lightning. Eventually, the ride was safely lowered once conditions stabilized and no physical injuries were reported. This was the moment a 5-year-old boy fell into a gorilla enclosure and found himself surrounded by one of the world's most powerful primates. After plunging roughly 15 feet into the gorilla exhibit at Jersey Zoo in 1986, the unconscious child lay helpless on the concrete floor as several gorillas approached. Horrified spectators feared they were about to witness a fatal attack. But instead, the troop's dominant silverback Jambo moved toward the boy and positioned himself between him and the other gorillas. As the child remained motionless, Jambo watched over him, gently stroked his back, and kept the rest of the troop at a distance. For several tense minutes, the 450-pound silverback stood guard over the injured boy while zoo staff prepared a rescue. When keepers finally entered the enclosure, Jambo calmly backed off and allowed them to carry the child to safety. The boy survived with a broken hand and minor injuries, and footage of the incident was broadcast around the world. At a time when gorillas were often portrayed as violent, dangerous beasts in movies and pop culture, Jambo's actions helped change public perception of the species worldwide, showing millions of people a gentler and more protective side of one of humanity's closest relatives. Now at this time, I ask you all to hold a moment of silence for Harambe, who suffered a much more tragic outcome in a similar circumstance. Thank you. This heartbreaking photo shows Chinese kidnapping victim Yang Niuhua learning that both of her parents had died years earlier after spending decades searching for her following her abduction as a child. Yang was kidnapped at just 5 years old in Guizhou, China in the 1990s and trafficked far from her hometown, only discovering 26 years later that her devastated father had become an alcoholic and died just 2 years after she vanished, while her mother later died as a result of severe depression and grief, never knowing her daughter was still alive. Years later, Yu's relentless pursuit of justice helped track down her kidnapper Yu Huang, a trafficker linked to at least 17 abducted children, ultimately leading to Yu's conviction and death sentence. In Manila, there are long-standing reports of people living in the city's drainage tunnels, often called the Mole People. These communities are made up of homeless families, runaway kids, and people avoiding police or poverty on the surface. Outreach workers have found makeshift shelters built along the concrete wall, children with severe light sensitivity from spending so much time underground, and tunnels where the air is thick with sewage and rats. During heavy rains, flash floods run through the system without warning, and entire encampments have been washed out, with bodies sometimes recovered blocks away. This was the moment a Utah driver's life was instantly put in danger. A pickup truck rear-ended the SUV at a railroad crossing, pushing it onto the tracks at the worst time possible. As the crossing arms came down, the driver tried to reverse but got stuck. Footage showed the conductor wailing on the horn and hitting the emergency brakes, but there was no way to stop in time. With the massive train rapidly approaching, the driver had no choice but to abandon the vehicle and run. Moments later, the train slammed into it, instantly destroying the car and causing over $100,000 in damage. Police later cited the pickup truck for following too closely, saying the entire incident began with the rear-end collision. This man was trying to close a metal gate when something went horribly wrong. As he pulled the two metal doors together, an electrical fault had apparently energized the gate, electrocuting him immediately. Unable to let go, he remained stuck to the gate as electricity coursed through his body. Luckily, his coworker realized what was happening and quickly drop-kicked him away from the gate, instead of grabbing him directly, which could have gotten them both electrocuted. Amazingly, the man survived. If his friend hesitated for even a few more seconds or approached the situation any differently, the outcome most likely would have been much worse. At 14 years old, Megan Dixon suddenly lost the ability to walk after developing a rare neurological condition in Cambridgeshire, England. Over the following years, her condition worsened so severely that her legs became permanently locked straight and eventually bent backward at unnatural angles, leaving her in constant pain and unable to stand or sit normally. After years of paralysis, seizures, hospitalization, and unsuccessful attempts to reverse the damage, doctors determined her knees were beyond repair. At just 21 years old, she's now preparing to have both legs amputated in hopes of finally regaining some independence and ending the chronic pain that has dominated much of her life. In 2016, heavy rains hit Dhaka, Bangladesh just after Eid al-Adha, an Islamic holiday that commemorates Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his own son in obedience to God. During the celebration, hundreds of thousands of animals were sacrificed across the city. Blood from the animals mixed with floodwater and overflowed into the streets, creating what many people called rivers of blood. Photos of entire roads running red spread across the world and drew criticism from animal rights advocates, who argued that the scale of the slaughter was disturbing and inhumane. That was the sound of gunshots echoing through the streets during the siege of Sarajevo in the Bosnian War. During the siege, civilians lived under constant sniper fire from soldiers positioned in the surrounding mountains. Between 1992 and 1995, more than 10,000 people were killed in the city, including at least 1,500 children. Decades later, investigators finally uncovered extremely disturbing evidence suggesting some of those sniper positions were used for what became known as the Sarajevo Sniper Safari. According to testimony in ongoing criminal investigations, wealthy foreign visitors allegedly paid tens of thousands of dollars to Bosnian Serb forces for the opportunity to fire at innocent civilians trapped inside the besieged city. Witnesses claim the visitors were escorted to hillside sniper nests overlooking Sarajevo, where they could shoot at people crossing streets or running between buildings. Some reports even described a price list for targets, with higher payments allegedly associated with killing children. Italian prosecutors opened a war crimes investigation in 2025, and the first suspect has been formally placed under investigation for multiple counts of murder related to the alleged sniper tourism. Ty Pennington nearly died after ignoring what he thought was just a sore throat for over a month. In 2023, the infection turned out to be a massive throat abscess that became so severe it started blocking his airway, leaving him struggling to breathe. Pennington was rushed to the ICU, intubated, and flown to another hospital for emergency surgery. He later said doctors told him he easily could have died if he waited any longer to get treatment. In the early days of cars, drivers who killed pedestrians were often blamed for what newspapers called motor killings. But as deaths began to rise in the 1920s, automobile companies pushed the term jaywalker to shift blame onto pedestrians, helping normalize the idea that people hit by cars were at fault for their own deaths. The Cave Creek disaster occurred in 1995 at Paparoa National Park in New Zealand, when 17 people crowded onto a newly built viewing platform overlooking Cave Creek on a field trip. the structure suddenly tore away from the cliffside and collapsed forward, sending the group plunging nearly 40 meters onto the rocks below. 14 people were killed, most of them university students, while the survivors suffered devastating injuries. Investigators later discovered the platform had been catastrophically poorly built, with several missing bolts and critical structural flaws. However, no individual was ever criminally convicted over the disaster. This video shows a dolphin playing with a pufferfish, nudging and rolling it around in the water. When threatened, pufferfish release a powerful tetrodotoxin, deadly in high doses but may produce a mild narcotic effect in small amounts. Researchers believe dolphins sometimes provoke the fish just enough to trigger a small release of the toxin before lingering near the surface in a calm, almost trance-like state, highlighting the high intelligence of these creatures and how this intoxication-seeking behavior appears strikingly similar to humans. This cat seems to know exactly how to get its owner's attention, using the door knocker knowing that it's loud enough for the person inside to hear. For the first time on record, scientists documented a wild orangutan deliberately treating his own injury using a medicinal plant. In 2022, a male orangutan named Rakis was observed with an open facial wound, after which he selected leaves from a plant known for its anti-inflammatory properties, chewed them into a pulp, and carefully applied the juice directly onto the wound. He then pressed the leftover plant matter over the injury, effectively forming a crude bandage. Researchers noted the wound healed perfectly without signs of infection, marking the first confirmed case of a wild non-human animal independently performing a multi-step medical treatment on itself. In October of 2024, Micah Smith took his 3 young children, ages 2, 4, and 8, on a 9-mile hike in Utah that authorities described as extremely difficult and dangerous, especially as a major storm was rolling in. Court records say Smith failed to check the weather and continued climbing, even after sending photos of the incoming storm to his wife, who urged him to turn back. Investigators say he refused, later telling police he was comfortable hiking in the dark without lights. By the time they reached the summit around 6 p.m., hail and snow had started falling. The family began descending, but only made it about 600 feet before one child fell and struck their head. At that point, Smith decided to shelter in place overnight with the children, despite worsening weather and inadequate clothing. During the night, prosecutors say the children repeatedly said they were cold, exhausted, and wanted to go home. One child allegedly begged Smith to turn back earlier, saying she was afraid she might not survive, but he refused, calling the hike a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Court documents state Smith later claimed he performed CPR on his son overnight and instructed his daughter to continue the CPR before leaving his children behind. When search and rescue teams located Smith the next day, he was all alone and appeared completely unconcerned about his kids, telling responders he believed one of his children was already dead. A helicopter crew later found the 3 children together, severely hypothermic and inadequately clothed. All 3 children ultimately survived, though 2 were in critical condition, and one had a core body temperature of 63 degrees Fahrenheit that led to a stroke and emergency brain surgery. Smith was later charged with aggravated child abuse and child torture, with prosecutors requesting no bail, arguing he repeatedly chose to continue, despite warnings from the children, their mother, and the worsening weather. Here's a photo of Daniel Pearl during his captivity in 2002, after the Wall Street Journal reporter was kidnapped in Pakistan while investigating extremist networks. Pearl was held by militants linked to Al-Qaeda, and investigators later concluded he was murdered by Khalil Sheikh Mohammed, the architect of the 9/11 attacks. After weeks in captivity, a video surfaced showing Pearl forced to read statements on camera before he was beheaded, with the footage circulating online as extremist propaganda. The killing drew worldwide outrage, not only for its brutality, but because Pearl had been abducted while simply pursuing a journalism assignment. Here's a body cam still of Tiffany Taylor speaking with police after she escaped an encounter with New Jersey serial killer Khalil Wheeler Weaver in 2016. Taylor told officers that he targeted black sex workers because he believed their disappearances would draw less attention, but her report was not fully acted on at the time. Prosecutors later said Wheeler Weaver continued killing, targeting vulnerable women he met online. Frustrated by the lack of progress, friends of one victim carried out their own social media investigation, eventually helping link him to multiple cases. The information ultimately contributed to his arrest, and he was later convicted of several murders and sentenced to life in prison. In the summer of 2025, Jordan Peterson nearly died after developing pneumonia and sepsis that left him in the ICU for weeks. His daughter later revealed that the illness began after he was exposed to heavy mold while cleaning out his late father's basement, triggering what she called chronic inflammatory response syndrome, a rare and unofficial life-threatening immune condition. He reportedly suffered nerve damage, extreme sensitivities to medication, and even paralysis. It wasn't the first time Peterson's health had spiraled. Years earlier, he'd endured a near-fatal benzodiazepine withdrawal that required months of treatment abroad. This latest crisis left him bedridden and fighting for his life once again, with his daughter saying that for days, doctors weren't sure if he'd survive. Now, months later, Peterson is slowly recovering. He has reportedly regained much of his mobility, is speaking and reading again, and continues intensive physical therapy from home. His daughter says he's still very fragile but improving daily, though his public appearances, lectures, and recordings remain on hold as he focuses on regaining full strength after what she called the closest he's ever been to dying. This was the moment a jewelry store was wiped out in just 30 seconds. In 2025 in Fremont, California, nearly 24 thieves stormed into Kumar Jewelers at once armed with hammers and tools. Within seconds, they began smashing display cases and sweeping jewelry into bags as employees were forced to stand back. By the time it was over, $1.7 million worth of jewelry, about 80% of the store's inventory, was wiped out in just over a minute. The group dispersed in multiple getaway cars and several arrests were later made, but most of the crew remains unidentified and the majority of the stolen jewelry has never been found. In New York City, Darius McCollum developed an obsessive fixation on the transit system that led him to repeatedly impersonate MTA employees and take control of buses and subway trains. Beginning as a teenager, he was arrested more than 30 times after entering restricted areas, operating vehicles, and running full routes while delivering accurate announcements and staying on schedule. He wasn't stealing the vehicles or trying to escape, he was operating the job with precision. Each incident still carried real risk, and over time the pattern didn't stop. He continued being arrested well into adulthood, spending years cycling through jail and psychiatric evaluations. Despite national attention and a 2016 documentary about his case, there was still no long-term solution put in place, as he remained stuck between the transit system he was obsessed with and a justice system that had no idea how to effectively handle the situation.